In early 1968, the most powerful military in the world deliberately allows around 6,000 of its men to be surrounded on a remote plateau in the far northwest of South Vietnam. Many in the American command expect that when the enemy masses to crush them, overwhelming US firepower will turn the trap inside out and annihilate everything that gathers around the base. Instead, the siege of Khe Sanh becomes an obsession that haunts a president, dominates the front pages for 77 days, and pushes the United States closer to using nuclear weapons in Vietnam than at any other moment in the war. To understand what General William Westmoreland does when Khe Sanh is surrounded, you first have to understand why he wants it surrounded at all. The encirclement is not something that happens to the American command. In large part, it is something the American command invites. By the end of 1967, Westmoreland, commander of Military Assistance Command Vietnam, Lang Vei, has been running a war of attrition for more than 3 years. The logic is simple. American firepower is overwhelming. North Vietnamese manpower is not infinite, and if the enemy can be drawn into pitched battles where that firepower can be brought to bear, the math will eventually favor the United States. The problem is that the enemy rarely cooperates. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces choose when and where to fight, strike, and melt back into the jungle, and across borders the Americans are not allowed to cross. The body counts climb, the metrics suggest progress, and yet the war does not end. It is a frustration that defines the entire American approach, and it shapes everything that happens at Khe Sanh. There is a deeper assumption underneath all this. The American command believes superior technology and firepower, applied with enough patience, will substitute for the things it lacks: a clear front line, a cooperative enemy, and a political objective that can be reached by force of arms. Attrition is not just a tactic, it is a theory about how this particular war can be won without answering the harder question of why it is being fought. Khe Sanh will become the purest expression of that theory, and its outcome will reveal both the theory's real power and its essential hollowness. The base sits 14 miles south of the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, and just 6 miles from the Laotian border. It began as a special forces camp in the early 1960s, an old French outpost on a plateau astride Route 9, the main road running from the South Vietnamese coast into Laos. The position is useful for watching the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the network of roads and paths through which North Vietnam feeds men and supplies south. Westmoreland values it for another reason too. He sees it as a potential springboard for the operation he wants most, and is never permitted to attempt: a ground thrust into Laos to sever the trail at its source. Through 1967, the general steadily reinforces the position. The 26th Marine Regiment, reinforced, is sent to hold it, bringing the garrison to around 6,000 men under Colonel David Lowndes, who will run the base through the entire siege under conditions few commanders ever face. When American intelligence detects entire North Vietnamese divisions moving toward the area in late 1967 and early 1968, the reaction in Saigon is not alarm. It is closer to anticipation. This is the crux of the matter. Westmoreland believes the North Vietnamese are massing to capture Khe Sanh, and rather than pull the garrison out of harm's way, he chooses to let the enemy come. The reasoning follows the logic of attrition to its furthest conclusion. If the enemy wants to concentrate 3 divisions, perhaps 20,000 men or more, around a fixed point in open country far from the population centers, then he is offering the American command exactly what it has been chasing for 3 years: a target that will not move. The plan, in essence, is to use the Marines as bait, then destroy everything that collects around them with the largest concentration of firepower in the history of war. Westmoreland gives the firepower operation a name. He calls it Operation Niagara because, in his words, the name suggests an image of cascading shells and bombs. The metaphor is apartment. What he intends is a waterfall of high explosive. Still, the figures do not tell the whole story, and the general's confidence rests on a comparison that worries almost everyone above him. 14 years earlier, in 1954, the French garrisoned a remote outpost in a valley called Dien, allowed themselves to be surrounded by a numerically superior communist force, and were destroyed. That defeat ended French rule in Indochina. The parallels to Khe Sanh are uncomfortably exact. Both are isolated outposts that can be observed and shelled from surrounding high ground. Both depend entirely on aerial resupply. Both are held by elite troops, and both face an army commanded by the same man, the North Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Yap. Every educated officer in the American chain of command knows the comparison, and most of them find it haunting rather than reassuring. No one finds it more haunting than the president. Lyndon Johnson becomes, by the accounts of those around him, nearly obsessed with Khe Sanh. He has a sand table model of the base and its terrain, built in the basement situation room of the White House, and he descends to study it at all hours, in his bathrobe, examining aerial photographs and troop dispositions as if he can will the position to hold by attention alone. And he makes a demand of his military leadership that is, by most assessments, without precedent. He insists the Joint Chiefs of Staff give him a written guarantee that Khe Sanh will not fall. Exactly what passes between the president and his generals has been disputed ever since. Johnson later claims he made each chief sign a paper stating the base could be held. The declassified meeting notes are more measured. They show that on January 29, 1968, the president asks the chiefs whether they are completely in agreement that everything has been done to ensure Westmoreland can handle the coming offensive, and that General Earl Wheeler, the chairman, and the chiefs assure him everything requested has been granted and that they are confident. Whether that amounts to a formal signed declaration or something less is a thing the participants remember differently. What is not in dispute is the president's state of mind. He has told congressional leaders the chiefs signed a paper, and he is emphatic that he does not want another Dien Bien Phu on his watch. So the political stakes are enormous before a single major assault is launched. Westmoreland has staked his reputation on holding a position he deliberately let be surrounded, and the president has attached his own credibility to the outcome. This is the situation when the shelling begins. On January 21, 1968, North Vietnamese forces open the siege with a massive artillery bombardment. The opening barrage hits the base's main ammunition dump and detonates something on the order of 1,500 tons of explosives in a chain of secondary blasts that throw live shells across the perimeter. One round strikes a store of tear gas and saturates the base. 14 Marines are killed and dozens wounded in those first hours, and roughly 90% of the garrison's own artillery and mortar ammunition is destroyed on the opening day. The base that is supposed to be the anvil is nearly wrecked before the battle properly begins. Westmoreland's response is immediate and characteristic. He does not reconsider the decision to hold. He moves to bring the full weight of American air power to bear, launching the firepower campaign he has been preparing. Niagara comes in two parts. The first Niagara is an intelligence effort, a saturation of the area with reconnaissance flights, electronic sensors, and observation aimed at pinpointing every enemy gun, trench, bunker, and assembly area. The second, Niagara 2, is the application. Once a target is located, it is struck by tactical aircraft, by artillery, and above all by the B-52 Stratofortress heavy bombers flying from bases as far away as Guam. The scale is hard to convey in ordinary terms. Over the siege, American aircraft fly tens of thousands of sorties against the forces around Khe Sanh. The B-52 strikes alone, codenamed Arc Light missions, deliver close to 60,000 tons of munitions across roughly 2,500 sorties. In total, American air forces drop in the region of 75,000 tons of bombs around the base, a tonnage some accounts equate to several Hiroshima-scale explosions spread across the surrounding hills and valleys. The plateau and its approaches are churned into a cratered moonscape. The bombers are brought in closer to friendly lines than doctrine normally allows, walking their strikes to within a few hundred meters of the Marine positions. This is the operational expression of Westmoreland's entire theory of the war. The enemy has concentrated, and the concentration is being destroyed from the air on a scale no army has ever sustained against a fixed position. The general is, by his own later account, elated at the performance of the heavy bombers. He goes so far as to credit the battle to the men of the B-52 force, claiming that what breaks the back of the North Vietnamese at Khe Sanh is basically the fire of the B-52s. That confidence proves more complicated than the tonnage suggests. The bombing is devastating, but it is not omniscient. A North Vietnamese prisoner captured in April tells his interrogators that his unit received frequent, timely and accurate warnings of incoming B-52 strikes, usually around 2 hours' notice, enough to disperse before the bombs fall. The source of those warnings is never firmly established. It is a reminder that even the most overwhelming firepower operates against an enemy who adapts, and that a cratered landscape does not necessarily mean the casualties the American command hopes it means. The body count at Khe Sanh, like the body count across the whole war, is an estimate wrapped in considerable uncertainty. While the bombs fall, the harder problem is keeping the garrison alive. A surrounded base is only as strong as its supply line, and Khe Sanh runs entirely through the air. Here the comparison to Dien Bien Phu cuts in Westmoreland's favor, and he knows it. The French in 1954 relied on slow twin-engine transports flying a 400-mile round trip, capable of delivering perhaps 100 tons of supplies a day on a good day. Westmoreland, by contrast, commands a vast airlift apparatus built up across South Vietnam since 1966, including wings of fast, 4-engine C-130 Hercules transports flying barely 100 miles from Da Nang, each carrying far heavier loads. Where the French parachuted in around 100 tons a day, the American capability runs to several hundred. The President's own staff work these comparisons obsessively, noting the United States has thousands of aircraft and helicopters available against the few dozen the French possessed. The airlift is not safe. The runway sits under constant observed artillery fire, and landing a transport on it becomes one of the most dangerous jobs in the theater. Air crews adapt with techniques designed to minimize time on the ground. Low-altitude extraction systems that drag pallets out of a moving aircraft as it skims the strip without stopping, and parachute drops onto designated zones. The supply line holds. For all the danger, the garrison is never starved, never short of ammunition once the initial loss is replaced, and never forced into the logistical collapse that doomed the French. This is perhaps the single most important difference between the two sieges, and it is one Westmoreland has guaranteed by giving Khe Sanh priority over every other operation in Vietnam. The conditions on the ground, meanwhile, are familiar from every account of the war. The base sits exposed on its plateau, ringed by hills the enemy holds or contests. Low cloud and seasonal weather frequently ground or hamper air support for stretches at a time. The North Vietnamese ring the marine lines with entrenched infantry and a heavy concentration of anti-aircraft weapons, well over 300 sites by some counts, each of which has to be found and destroyed before transports and close support aircraft can operate with any safety. The nearest major Allied base lies tens of miles away over a road that has been cut, and the Marines hold the base and several outlying hill positions under near-daily bombardment that at its peak runs to well over 1,000 rounds a day. Then comes the moment that tests everything, and it comes not at Khe Sanh itself, but a few miles to the west. On the night of February 6th and into the 7th, North Vietnamese forces assault the Special Forces camp at Lang Vei on Route 9 between Khe Sanh and the Lao Tien border. What makes the attack significant is not just that the camp falls, it is how it falls. The North Vietnamese attack with tanks, Soviet-built armor, the first time in the war the enemy employs tanks in a coordinated ground assault. The defenders, a mix of Special Forces advisors and indigenous troops, are overrun. More than 200 of the camp's defenders are killed or captured. The fall of Lang Vei poses an immediate dilemma for the American command. Survivors flee toward Khe Sanh seeking refuge, and the question of whether to mount a rescue collides with the reality that any force sent out along that road would itself be exposed to the same encircling enemy. The decision is made not to attempt a major overland relief of Lang Vei. It is a cold piece of arithmetic. The garrison cannot be weakened, and the road cannot be held. The appearance of enemy armor so close to the base also raises an alarming possibility that the Marines themselves might face a tank-supported assault, and it sharpens the sense in Saigon and Washington that the decisive blow may be coming. It is against this backdrop, in the first half of February, that Westmoreland does the thing that will stay secret for half a century, and that, more than any tonnage of bombs, defines the answer to what he is prepared to do to hold Khe Sanh. he begins planning to use nuclear weapons. The sequence, reconstructed from documents declassified decades later, runs like this. In late January, with Lang Vei not yet fallen but the pressure mounting, Westmoreland asks the commander of Pacific Forces, Admiral Ulysses S. Grant Sharp, about moving tactical nuclear weapons within reach of Khe Sanh, low-yield battlefield warheads that could be used on short notice if the base faced being overrun. On February 1st, General Wheeler sends Westmoreland a message asking his views on whether there are targets around Khe Sanh suited to nuclear strikes and whether contingency planning is in order. Wheeler frames the prospect as unlikely but worth examining. The reply reveals that Westmoreland and Sharp are already ahead of the question. A special planning group has been convened in Okinawa, operating under the strictest secrecy, and it has a name. The plan is called Fracture Jaw. Fracture Jaw is a contingency to move nuclear weapons into South Vietnam so they can be used quickly against the North Vietnamese forces around Khe Sanh if conventional means fail to break the siege. On February 10th, Westmoreland sends a message stating the plan has been approved by him and discussing readiness to implement it should circumstances require. There are, at that moment, no nuclear weapons inside South Vietnam, and as the President's National Security Advisor, Walt Rostow, notes in a memorandum, putting them there would require presidential authority. That memorandum is how the plan unravels. Rostow alerts Johnson to what Westmoreland has set in motion, and the President's reaction is immediate and furious. Whatever his anxieties about Khe Sanh, and they are considerable, the prospect of introducing nuclear weapons into the Vietnam War is a line he will not approach. The likely international outcry, the risk of drawing China directly into the conflict, the political catastrophe at home, all of it makes the idea intolerable. Johnson orders Fracture Jaw shut down. All work on it ceases by February 12th, and the President directs that everyone with knowledge of the plan be debriefed so there can be no disclosure that such planning ever took place. It stays buried until the documents surface in the 21st century. The episode deserves to be handled carefully rather than sensationally. It is not entirely clear whether Westmoreland personally favors using nuclear weapons, or whether he is doing the due diligence of a theater commander obligated to examine every option for a position he has been ordered to hold at all costs. The planning is real, the approval he gives is real, and the President's alarm is real. What the episode reveals is the weight that has accumulated on Khe Sanh. A 6,000-man garrison on a remote plateau has become so freighted with strategic and political meaning that the men responsible for it are willing, at least on paper, to weigh crossing the most consequential threshold in modern warfare to keep it from falling. The supreme irony of all this attention is that the great assault Westmoreland is waiting for never fully comes. While the American command fixes its gaze on Khe Sanh, certain the base is the enemy's primary objective, and a second Dien Bien Phu in the making, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive on January 30th and 31, striking cities and towns the length of South Vietnam, including the old imperial capital of Hue, and even the grounds of the American embassy in Saigon. The fixation on Khe Sanh has contributed to the command's failure to anticipate the scale and direction of that offensive. Whether Khe Sanh is always intended as a diversion to draw American attention and reserves toward the border, or whether it is a genuine attempt to take the base that the Americans simply defeat, is a question historians have never fully settled. What is clear is that the largest battle Westmoreland has been preparing for resolves itself not in a climactic ground assault, but in a slow, grinding bleed of the besieging force under the relentless air campaign. By March, the pressure around the base is easing, and Westmoreland turns to the final phase of his design. He has ordered relief planning almost as soon as the siege began, directing General John Tolson of the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, to prepare a contingency for an overland relief as early as the last week of January. Tolson is not enthusiastic. He believes his Airmobile division would be better used striking into the A Shau Valley after Tet, and he understands Westmoreland's interest in relieving Khe Sanh is bound up with the general's enduring ambition to use it as a springboard into Laos. But the order stands. The plan that emerges is named Operation Pegasus. On April 1st, 1968, the relief begins. It is at that point one of the largest operations of the war. The 1st Cavalry Division, reinforced by Marine regiments and South Vietnamese airborne and ranger units, drives toward Khe Sanh along 2 axes. Marine forces push west along Route 9 to reopen the road, while the air-mobile cavalry leapfrogs by helicopter to seize key terrain ahead of the advance, a method that plays to the division's particular strength. The construction of a forward airstrip near Ca Lu is a key enabler of the whole effort. The North Vietnamese, already worn down, offer scattered resistance but are largely withdrawing. On April 8th, elements of the 1st Cavalry link up with the Marines, and the siege is declared broken. Route 9 is reported fully open by April 11th, and on April 10th the cavalry recaptures the ruins of the Lang Vei camp. Operation Pegasus is formally concluded on April 15th. The cost of the relief itself is relatively modest by the standards of the war. American forces in Pegasus suffer on the order of 90 killed and several hundred wounded, with South Vietnamese losses on top of that, against North Vietnamese casualties estimated at over 1,000. The cost of the siege as a whole is harder to pin down, and here the figures demand caution. The official Marine casualty figure most often cited, around 200 killed and over 1,600 wounded, actually covers the longer operational period from November 1967 through the end of March, not merely the 77 days of the siege proper. Other tallies that fold in the surrounding actions, the hill fights, the loss of Lang Vei, and the relief, run considerably higher. One careful researcher who studied the battle for decades puts total American casualties from the start of operations through the eventual abandonment of the base at close to 1,000 killed, with North Vietnamese deaths in the area of 5,500. Enemy losses overall are estimated anywhere from several thousand into the tens of thousands, figures that depend heavily on assumptions about how many men the bombing killed in positions no American ever inspected. The honest answer is that the precise toll at Khe Sanh remains unresolved, and any single confident number should be treated with suspicion. What is beyond dispute is what happens to the base itself, and it is the final deflating turn in the whole affair. Westmoreland has insisted Khe Sanh be held at all costs. He has given it priority over every other operation, staked his reputation on it, weighed the unthinkable to preserve it, and mounted a major operation to relieve it. In June 1968, he leaves Vietnam to become Army Chief of Staff and is succeeded as commander by General Creighton Abrams. Abrams looks at the same plateau and reaches the opposite conclusion. He judges that the North Vietnamese have shifted tactics, that the Marines have the mobility to operate in the area without a fixed garrison, and that the base serves no purpose worth the cost of defending it. Within weeks of the siege being lifted, the order is given to dismantle Khe Sanh. The position held at the price of an entire winter's strategic attention, the one a commander was prepared to use nuclear weapons to save, is bulldozed and abandoned by his successor. That sequence captures something essential about the American conduct of the war. On its own terms, Westmoreland's defense of Khe Sanh is a tactical success. The base does not fall. The enemy concentration is subjected to a weight of firepower without precedent. The garrison is kept supplied through a siege that destroyed the French 14 years earlier under nearly identical conditions. By the metrics the general values, enemy dead and ground held, Khe Sanh is a victory, and he claims it as one. There is a further consequence worth weighing, one that reaches beyond the plateau. The very intensity of the American focus on Khe Sanh, the president studying his sand table at night, the firepower poured into a single position, the planning that reaches as far as nuclear contingencies, all of it draws attention away from the broader offensive the enemy launches across South Vietnam at the end of January. Senior officials, convinced Khe Sanh is the main event, are slower to grasp that the attacks on the cities are not a diversion from the real blow, but the blow itself. Whether the North Vietnamese designed Khe Sanh specifically to produce that misdirection, or whether the Americans simply misread a genuine attempt to take the base, the effect is the same. The position that consumes the most attention may be the one that matters least to the enemy's actual plan. It is a possibility that should temper any clean claim of victory. But the value of a tactical victory depends entirely on whether the thing defended was worth defending, and that is the question Westmoreland's own theory of the war never adequately answers. The base matters because he decides it matters, and the enemy obliges him by gathering around it, and the firepower does its work. The moment the man who assigned that value departs, the value evaporates. A position cannot be simultaneously so vital that its commander will weigh nuclear weapons to hold it, and so expendable that it is demolished within weeks of being saved. Both things are true of Khe Sanh, which suggests the importance was never really about the plateau at all. It is about the unwillingness to be seen to lose, about a president haunted by a French ghost, and about a strategy that measures success in enemy dead and acreage held, rather than in any outcome that brings the war closer to an end. What Westmoreland does when Khe Sanh is surrounded is exactly what his entire approach to Vietnam has trained him to do. He pours firepower onto a fixed enemy. He refuses to yield ground, and he reaches for ever more extreme means to guarantee a result he has defined as essential. The plateau holds. The strategy that made it seem to matter does not.